السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وأصحابه ومن والاه. اللهم تقبل منا صيامنا وقيامنا وصلاتنا. اللهم طهر قلوبنا واجمع قلوبنا على محبتك وطاعتك. اللهم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك وطاعتك. اللهم افتح مسامع قلوبنا لذكرك واجعل خير أيامنا وأسعدها يوم نلقاك برحمتك وجودك وكرمك يا رب العالمين. آمين. Well, this is the day before last. As probably all of you know, it is not Eid tomorrow. Why? Where wasn't it cited? Anywhere in the world? Saudi Arabia. And therefore it's not Eid. So I hope that most of you here, we are learning the proper Shari'i methodology and rational scientific methodology as well. It has nothing to do with that. You have to stop thinking that way. You have to stop feeling that way. It has nothing to do with that. It is not Eid tomorrow because in our part of this world, it is impossible for it to be cited, and it has not been cited, and it will not be cited. Every astronomer knows if it were to be cited, it's like a miracle. It's a world record that has never been heard of in our part of the world even. Do you know how old is the moon now? By now it's 10 o'clock here, 10 p.m. Do you know how old it is in our area? A little more, yeah, about that. Because in accordance to our local time, the moon was born at around 6 a.m., 6:01 a.m. in accordance to the U.S. Naval Observatory. 6 a.m. in the morning in accordance to our time. At Maghrib time, which is 20:39, 8:39 p.m. to around 8:39, 8:40 p.m. How many hours of difference is that? 14 and some, almost 15 hours. 15 hours is too young to be cited. It's beyond the thing that we spoke about, the donjon limit. There's nothing there to be cited, even with a telescope. How many hours? 15 hours. And sometimes you hear in the East, it is 8 hours old, 12 hours old, and the claim is that next day is Ramadan. Some say even to see it. This has been a pattern and a trend for years, to the extent that every faqih knowledgeable of science and every scientist knowledgeable of fiqh knows that it has nothing to do with sighting. It has to do with the calculation of the birth of the moon, and as long as it does not set before the sun sets in that part of the world, then the start is done. Why isn't it not in Saudi Arabia? They have not declared Ramadan Eid tomorrow in accordance to this pattern, because this time it's obviously too obvious. Because in that part of the world, in accordance to Mecca time, let's say, the moon was born around 14 hours. That is 2 p.m. their time. 2 p.m. their time. Sunset in Mecca is around, today was around, who knows, 7 p.m., 7:01, 7 p.m. or 7:07, I think. 7 p.m. How many hours between birth of the moon and sunset? Barely 5 hours. And because it's so little, and in this case, in that part of the world, the moon sets in Mecca and in all Saudi Arabia actually, and beyond a little bit to the west, sets before the sun sets. Moon sets before the sun sets. So there's nothing to see. Nothing to see, even if it's otherwise. So if you looked at a map, and I didn't have a chance to bring it here for you to show you, you see that that part of the world, and west, south of Arabia also, it's all red zone. In all that red zone, many countries, including many countries in the Middle East, the moon sets before the sun sets. So there's no way. It's not about sighting. It's about, if it is born and at moonset, at sunset, the moon is still above the horizon. That's usually the criterion that they have been using, and therefore it is decided, even if it is not sightable. Now that's one thing. So in that zone, is it east or west of us? Very far east. Then it's all, most of that region is red zone. If you look, our region is not red zone. It's all transparent zone, and then west of us, in the Pacific somewhere, then starts the map. Starts that, those parabolas, way thousands of kilometers away from the west coast to the west, south a little bit. What does this tell you? We've been learning. Who relies on whom? East or west? For sighting the crescent. East should rely on west. And that's the law of Allah in nature. It's very against the laws of nature of Allah Azza wa Jal to say we are going to base ourselves on their sighting, if they follow sighting even. Because if they cite it, we will cite it. People in the West will cite it. If people in the West do not cite it, then it does not exist in the East. So be very careful. You are all mostly educated people. At this point of time, there are certain things. You ask some people, some ulama in fiqh, about which you have no knowledge. And then you argue as though you know. You that is editorial you, sometimes, not a specific person, when you shouldn't. Yet in this field of secular knowledge, you have some knowledge. You can argue. Instead, you surrender. Don't do that. Demand the actual, rational, scientific evidence. And that rational scientific evidence are the laws of Allah created in nature. So, 15 hours old in our area. In their area, it was 5 hours old. It's natural because we're west. Why? Because the moon rises in the east or in the west? In the east also. By the time it gets to the west to set, it's going to take a lot more time. So it's older, and the older it gets, the more sightable it becomes. And the more east you go, the less sightable it becomes. That's why in India and Pakistan sometimes Eid or Ramadan is a day later. It's natural, it's normal because they are east of Arabia. It's natural. It will be later there to be seen. So, and that's unfortunately many of us still remain uneducated about this very important aspect. And then we get sometimes some of us get emotional and get culturally emotional and get sometimes in the wrong way, religiously, fanatically emotional. And that's wrong for the wrong reasons. If we want to uphold the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, basing ourselves on sighting, not on anything else. So, 15 hours old at our sunset time. By now it's almost 17 hours old, and it's impossible to be sighted anywhere in all of the Americas and west of the Americas for a while till further down. Usually it should not be less than 20 to 23 hours old before there are chances to be sightable after its birth. So is it 8 tomorrow? Inshallah not.
So you're going to play Tarawih after Isha, or you're going to wait?
No, we're going to pray Tarawih, inshallah. The scholars in Saudi Arabia, may Allah Azza wa Jal forgive them and reward them. Some of them have spoken the truth, but wisely and tacitly. I showed you quotes, if you remember, this year and last year, their own handwritings and their own signatures, like Sheikh bin Baz and Sheikh Uthaymin, rahimahumullah, lahuma wa alayhima. There are things for them, they have sometimes opinions that we might disagree with, but rahimahumullah ta'ala, they were very clear on this issue. So you follow your own sightings. And of course, there are some scholars who have also, expressed their concern to the authorities about these claims of sightings when it is absolutely impossible, etc., etc. But they're doing it wisely. Remember, this is not the United States. So there are certain things to be considered, and certain norms, and certain standards, and certain cultural issues that have also to be taken into account for the welfare of the public as well, inshallah. So let's go to something else, more spiritual. But sometimes, unfortunately or fortunately, we need sometimes, dry logic to be able to be safe spiritually. Because if we go spiritually disregarding rationality, we can end up to be spiritually fanatical. And Allah created us with an intellect and with a heart, with a soul. Both are very important. And the luckiest one is the one for whom Allah granted balance between the two. And sometimes we have to be very clear rationally so that spiritually we can go on safely. If 1 + 1 + 1 is equal to 3, and then I say spiritually 1 + 1 + 1 is equal 1. And I argue that 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. And then on that basis I base a spirituality. Now hold on. 1 + 1 + 1 does not hold rationally. I cannot base a spiritual practice on the basis of that. So I have to be careful. You know what I mean? Sayyiduna Mawlana sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. You remember last night we spoke of, lastly, of adab. Adab with whom specifically? With Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam first, and by extension as the fiqh and the rules of fiqh Allah for those extensions. Adab with Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Our teachers, rahimahumullah ta'ala, our predecessors, our salaf, some of them used to say this, those scholars, rational and spiritual human beings and scholars used to say, your amal, your knowledge, your ilm, and your amal in accordance with that ilm, not knowledge alone. Ilm and amal will lead you to the gate. Will lead you to the gate. But your adab allows you to enter the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the divine dimension of Allah Azza wa Jalla, nearness. Ilm, proper ilm, and action in accordance to that proper ilm, not just ilm. Ilm can lead simply to arrogance sometimes, and to delusion, and to riya, and to ostentation, and to love to be the head, the leadership, and we're already plagued with that. Ilm with amal, practicing in accordance to that ilm in the religious and moral and ethical and spiritual realms in particular, and the fiqh realms. That ilm and that amal will lead the person, inshallah, when we die, and in this dunya spiritually, to arrive at the gate of the presence of Allah Azza wa Jal, at the gate. With adab, we enter. Nearness to Allah Azza wa Jal. Without adab, it is said, they used to say, without adab, you are turned back to the stable. I use that term. You're turned back to the stable. What does this mean? Exactly. In other words, we are like an animal. An animal without adab. Go back to the stable for what? Why do they say go back to the stable? To be tamed, yes. To be taught adab. Like a horse, before you give the horse as a gift to the king, you tame the horse in the stable. Then you offer the horse as a gift. And many of us are wild donkeys, not just horses. Horse is a beautiful thing. Many of us, and I do not absolve myself, we're like wild donkeys. We need to go back for adab. May Allah help us. Please, my dear beloved brothers and sisters, adab. Adab with Allah. Adab with Rasulullah. Adab with the awliya of Allah. Adab with the ulama of Allah. Adab with our elders. Adab with our teachers. Adab with our parents. Adab with the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Until a person whose heart is in that dimension, he or she is in adab in the streets. Under all circumstances, he or she is in adab because of that awareness of the beauty and the majesty of the divine subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of the adab that they taught us, rahimahullah ta'ala, through the Quran, through the Sunnah, and through what Allah inhibits in them of these beautiful adabi values. For example, one of them would say, I have never extended my leg in front of any human being. Is it haram to extend your leg in front of one? It's not haram. Is it mustahab? No, it's not mustahab. It's not something likable. In the shara' and in the culture in general, in still cultures that have still some values left. You don't extend your leg in front of anybody, let alone in front of Rasulullah. You go to the Rawdah and you sit like he's dead in the sense of he's a branch, he's a dry log in the qabr. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. We don't do that. We don't sit reading the Quran, forgive me my beloved brothers and sisters, extending our legs unless it is an absolute necessity. It's lack of adab with the book of Allah. I don't sit in the masjid and extend my leg towards the qibla. It is not haram. It's not haram. Don't misunderstand. It is not proper. It's not adab. Some say it is makruh. And therefore not adab. Some would not give their backs out of adab, not out of requirement. And I have seen that as a young person going to Hajj. I've seen elderly people from strange countries. When they leave out of adab, they do not turn their way to the Kaaba when they are leaving after Tawaf al-Wada. Not because they're committing bid'ah, that's nonsense. Because nobody says it's a law. Nobody says it's a hukm shar'i. It's an adab. It's an adab. It's the heart feels that way. There is no hukm shar'i to look at your father and you look at your father in the eyes and talk to him. Hukm shar'i doesn't say don't do that. But Allah would love if you lowered your gaze out of love and reverence and respect for Him. There is nowhere in the text that teaches you should do that. But that's adab. Adab in our old days, our ulama would say, one day a person had a problem, personal problem of some sort. And then he went to his sheikh and asked for advice. He said, maybe a while ago you walked in front of your father. Imagine that. You know, you see, everybody says, what is he talking about? Yeah, time has passed. We have become rough and spiritually uncivilized. We have become materialistically civilized in some ways, but spiritually and sometimes morally uncivilized. Yes, in other words, in those days you walk in front of your father, not for the sake of protection or the sake of help, but you walk in front of them as though you are the person important that deserves punishment of some spiritual sort, because that's lack of adab. You should walk behind your father, only if he says, come next to me, or walk in front of me for a reason. To raise your voice above the voice of your father, is it haram? No. If you do that angrily, it is haram. If you do that just because that's the way you are, it is improper. It is either makruh or lack of adab. You don't do that. That's why Allah teaches us about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, teaches the companions, do not raise the level of your voice above the level of his voice sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In Surah Al-Hujurat. وهكذا. Adab are too numerous to enlist. Sometimes some of that is learned, studied. Most of us nowadays don't study adab of that sort and learn them and read books about them. And some is given as a gift by Allah to the mind and the heart of some people. He makes them refined, naturally, as a gift. As someone is gifted by being generous, and someone doesn't have that, has to strive to be generous. Sometimes Allah gives the gift to a person of being one with beautiful adab. So, adab is not, don't say, well, where is it in the Quran, where is it in the Sunnah? In the Quran and in the Sunnah, it teaches in general that we should have adab. Adab specifically are uncountable. Uncountable. You cannot count it. So the Sunnah has not come with every adab. Like the Sunnah has not come with every haram and every wajib. But the principles for haram and wajib are there. That's why there is qiyas and there is this and there is that, etc. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us regain the original adab that our predecessors had, and that this ummah of Nabiyyina sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is supposed to have and is supposed to be holding leadership in the world. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يغفر لنا ويتوب علينا ويرحمنا. And again, because of these special circumstances, we have gone beyond the time. I hope inshallah ta'ala you would forgive me and you consider that in mizan of hasanatikum wa hasanatina inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.